Chapter 13, obscenity law.
I skimmed.
You skimmed obscenity law? Oh, all right. Just got the juicy parts? That's all you cared about? What is obscenity? Okay, one thing that you're bringing into it already, and I'm going to start marking these up on the board. Reasonable person standard. This is going to come back in a very, very important way later on. We now have a test. Comes out of Miller v. California. We're going to get there. This is going to be another one of those examples of the evolution of obscenity law. What we have now as our contemporary standard just didn't happen. It came at the end of numerous court cases and legal precedents. But not thinking about the book and what you've read, how do you define it? Cody said something that would offend reasonable. Okay, let me start you right there. How many people in here are reasonable people? You know, Chris, why aren't you reasonable?
Everybody else is reasonable.
Oh, so you want to be on? Okay. That's a problem, isn't it? We see this throughout the law. Remember all of these different tests that we've seen? What would a reasonable person say? That leaves some room for interpretation, doesn't it? Okay. Who can give me another? And again, it doesn't have to be textbook. It has to be your idea.
I have a question about the reasonable person standard. Like you were saying, like how reasonable would seem different. Would times change, like how things are seen as reasonable?
Yes. So we have reasonable person standard, and we have changes in time. These are two dramatic reasons why laws of obscenity have changed over the years. Obviously, what might have been considered obscene in the 19th century might no longer. Why would that be the case?
Exposure to things?
Exposure. How many people have been on that thing called the internet? Really? Okay. You know, there is a Broadway show called Avenue Q, and one of the songs from it is called "The Internet is what? For porn. The Internet is made for porn." That's the name of. That is a song title from a Broadway musical. Yes. Yes. And in fact, pornography is the single largest content on the internet. Okay. However, pornography in and of itself is not obscene. So I may make you feel a little better about yourself. I don't know. Who else? Dylan, what is your definition of obscene?
I don't know. Something, I don't know. Anything that would be like real gross, I guess.
We're gonna see where
violence or
okay, violence. Very interesting. That's not typically the way that our courts have looked at it. In the U.S., it's basically been what? Sex. We're going to get to a very important case where a Supreme Court justice said very much what you said, and that is, I don't know it, I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it.
I'm basically smart one of those guys.
You are indeed.
Or ladies.
You are indeed. Yes. Okay. So here is the textbook definition. I'll read this a few times for you. And then we're going to get into evolution. Obscenity is hardcore pornography that is so offensive and so lacking in social value that it is denied First Amendment protection. Obscenity is hardcore pornography that is so offensive and so lacking in social value that it is denied First Amendment protection. I'll repeat it again. So if I were to ask you on a quiz or a test, what is a definition of obscenity? This would be fine. And I know as Cody's looking, you're like, this also leaves a lot of room for interpretation, doesn't it? we're gonna get there. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
How, I mean, this is like how would, when I be in this case, like, with the definition you said, how would it have social value? How would?
We're gonna get to that. Hold on to that, because that's actually, that's what comes out of that very last test, that very last case out of, the evolution. So hold on to that question. It's an excellent question, though.
Can you repeat it?
Okay, one more time. Obscenity is hardcore pornography that is so offensive and so lacking in social value that it is denied First Amendment protection. There are other areas of speech that fall outside of First Amendment protection. Here's a good place to start reviewing for that comprehensive final. What are the other areas of speech that fall outside of First Amendment? We now know obscenity does.
Fighting.
Fighting words.
Hate.
There's a difference. No.
Free speech.
Remember, what else? So fighting words, obscenity.
Hate speech.
Is it contempt?
No. Perjury. You can't perjure yourself and then say, I have a First Amendment right to do that. And one more. False and misleading advertising. Very good. Which we're going to get into the commercial speech doctrine next week. So we'll learn about that. Okay. So let's start with the evolution. And we begin with what is known as the Hickman test. Up until the 1930s, courts in this country followed what is known as the Hickman test. And it came out of an English case in 1868. Again, I don't care that you know all the details. I don't care that you know that it's from England. But it did come out of that, from a case by the name of Regina v. Hickman. And this is the definition. Listen to this carefully. And these are all in your books, so you don't have to spend a whole lot of time writing this down. Under this particular test, judges considered a work to be obscene. Listen to this before you start writing. Just listen to how it sounds. If any portion of the material had a tendency, quote, to deprave or corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences, and into whose hands a publication of this sort may fall. Obviously, we're talking about the late 19th century, so it was primarily pamphlets, etc., books. Okay? It's obscene if any portion of it. This is going to be very, very important. And I say that I don't care too much that you know the details about that it was an English case, etc. But know that this is very important for the Hickman test. Any portion. Connor, do you have a question? Okay. Any portion. So what does that mean? That's okay, Travis. No one can read my handwriting. Yeah.
So like, say it was like some sort of book, like the cover page?
Yes.
Get you in trouble?
Or something on page 352 that lasted one sentence. That could have gotten the entire book banned. Yes.
So like a few words out of an entire.
Yes, indeed. And we're going to see that that has changed. That standard has changed over time. Okay. Okay. Any portion of the material had a tendency to deprave or corrupt. What does that mean, to deprave or corrupt?
To cancel? Is that what corrupt kind of means?
No, corrupt is doing what? Causing you to do bad things.
Oh.
Yeah. Doing what?
Like kids, like corrupting kids.
Like if you're corrupting kids, you can corrupt anybody. We can say that somebody or something is a corrupting influence. One might say that some of these video games that you kids play these days is a corrupting influence because of the violence. maybe, maybe not.
Insults people shout at each other online.
The insults that people shout at each other online.
2K, been there, done that.
Okay.
I'm retired.
To deprave or corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences. Okay, show of hands. How many people's minds in here are open to immoral influences? I have a very honest class here.
I don't know what that means.
Do you think that you could read something that might make you have thoughts that are impure?
See, that goes into the definitions of those words.
It does indeed.
My definition of impure is totally different from yours.
Yes, it does. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And what would happen back in this test? These standards do not apply. So whose determination was it? A judge. A judge. A judge would make those decisions. Okay. So if you had the opportunity to have an obscene pamphlet fall into your hand or a book, you had the opportunity to get it, and you were the type of person whose mind was open to immoral influences, and if any part of that book or pamphlet did that, under the Hickman test, it was obscene and could be banned without in any way violating the First Amendment.
So basically, any portion of the material that is obscene is banned by the Hickman test.
If any part of a larger, let's say an entire book, and it was only one page, they could ban the entire book. Okay. Clear on Hickman? Okay.
Do we need to know the test? Like,
Yes, you do.
parts?
Yes.
Are there parts? Or just that's in the book?
Just know what I'm saying in class.
Oh, you don't
Yeah, just know that much about Hickman. That's all I care about. Otherwise, we're going to get into a depth that only law students really should have to worry about, okay? Aren't you glad you picked obscenity day to come in and do this?
You're done, I think I
I
must
guess
stay.
so.
What's that? Very good. Okay. So 1933, a case called U.S. versus one book called Ulysses. By Shirley, thank you.
That's literally what the case is.
That is the case.
One book called.
One book called Ulysses. How many people have read Ulysses?
I don't.
Who's it by? James Joyce, who today is considered what? Probably the greatest author that Ireland has ever produced. But in 1933, United States, his book was being banned. What is now considered, here we come this passage of time, what we now consider great literature. It was being banned as being a dirty book. Okay. A federal district judge decided that this book should not be allowed to be imported and sold in the U.S. And he defined obscene as that which tended to stir the sex impulses or to lead to sexually impure and lustful thoughts. Sure. He defined obscene as tending to stir the sex impulses or to lead to sexually impure and lustful thoughts. A very interesting part of this that changes from this any portion in the Hickman test is that for the first time they focused on the literary value of the entire work. So for the very first, so here's a major change between Hickman and U.S. v. one book called Ulysses. And ultimately what happened in the Court of Appeals, which is what this case is, they found that it was not a dirty book. It didn't pass the test that was established. And that was, in its entirety, and its effect on a person with average sex instincts. Okay, show of hands again. Who has average sex instincts?
Average
Dylan's
what?
the only one.
Pretty average.
Once a week.
Missionary.
Okay. For people who have average sex instincts. What does that mean? Cody, here you go again. What does that mean? To have average sex instincts. It varies. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, in this case, the judge decided to allow it to be imported because it didn't pass this new test. And that is the idea that it is obscene to the person with average sex instincts, and it tends to stir the sex impulses or to lead to sexually impure and lustful thoughts. But he also, for the very first time, the judge took into consideration the literary value. Okay, questions about this evolution, this change from Hickman to U.S. versus one book called Ulysses.
So they basically go from one sentence can get you banned to let's look at it as a piece of work
In its entirety, and it changes from, remember, had a tendency to deprave or corrupt those whose minds are open to it, to tending to stir the sex impulses or to lead to sexually impure and lustful thoughts. What is it doing?
It's allowing violence. That makes the whole thing for.
Well, okay,
To totally let violence or any other ideas.
that's been the history of the United
What did it
States.
say?
And if you look at other nations, it's totally different, where sex is not a big problem, but they do ban violent behavior representations. But besides that, which is true, it narrows it more, right? It makes it more concrete. It goes from a tendency, the material has a tendency to deprave or corrupt those whose minds are open to immoral influences, without giving any kind of definition of what an immoral influence is. 2, it stirs sex impulses that lead to sexually impure and lustful thoughts. So it's specifically narrowing in on sexuality. Okay. So if I were to say, which I'm sure that I will, on a quiz, go through the evolution. This is number 1, this is number 2.
It's 2 strikes,
What's that?
but there's a 3-part, right?
There's more than that.
Uh-oh. Gonna have to get more than one out then. Strike the first guy out, we got another guy.
Yes, it was 1957. Roth versus U.S. 1957. Yes, sir.
57.
Just know the Hickman test that came out of Virginia v. Hickman. That's all I know that you know about. And then you need to know the changes that came out of U.S. versus one book called Ulysses. Okay?
What year was Virginia versus Hickman?
1868. And it was from England. So up until 1933, we didn't have any rulings whatsoever.
We just kind of adopted that one.
Yeah, we were, just like we'd had so much of the common law from England. And then that 33, which was in fact the U.S. versus one book called Ulysses, that's the first time that our courts took up this position in a way that provided legal precedent. Okay. 1957, what was about? I can finally point to a decade that I never lived through. What was world like in 1957?
Oh, bad. Red Scare.
Yeah, the Red
Korean War.
Scare.
Post-Korean War.
It was, yeah, just barely though.
Yeah.
Communism, But what did people say about the culture of the 1950s?
Conservative.
Very conservative. President Eisenhower was, you know, and his wife Mamie liked pink. She did the whole White House in pink. It was a time of repression, particularly sexual repression. And that's why we see the 60s as being such a dramatic change from the 50s. Yeah.
Was Allen Ginsberg's Howl, like, did it have the trial or whatever, like during this time?
Yep.
Okay.
Sure did. Sure did. This is the time when Elvis Presley was on television and they cut off his waist because they didn't like to see his hips gyrating. They thought that that was obscene. So the cameras had to come up and just show him above the waist. This was the day when Lucy and Ricky had to have separate beds even though they were married. I always thought, and I guess I just had one of these type of mind that they were talking about in U.S. versus one book called Ulysses. But as a kid watching the repeats, I thought the machinations involved in them producing little Ricky from 2 single beds, to me was a little more obscene than if they just had a nice big queen-size bed. What did they have to do? They pushed them together, okay? There actually were also laws, regulations, not laws, but regulations in Hollywood that if a film was being made with 2 people in bed, they each had to have at least 1 foot on the floor.
So he's getting out.
This is,
Nothing could happen if you would do that.
nothing at all. It was an extraordinarily repressed, boring time. Again, not that I lived through it, but that's why we see that reaction in the 60s, in the mid to late 60s. Okay. So we finally get to, in Roth v. United States, a U.S. Supreme Court case. The Ulysses case was an appellate court. So now we have the first time the U.S. court is coming in and overturning the Roth decision. It toppled Ulysses and it toppled the Hicklin test. And this is the new test that emerged. Let me read this to you. That the appropriate test for obscenity, quote, is whether to the average person. Okay? So Roth provided us average person standard. Applying contemporary community standards. So what did this do? It brought in this element of time. What's happening now? It also brought in the idea of geography. So that a case coming up in Edwardsville, okay, what do you think? Do you think that some work might have a better shot of being called obscene, ruled obscene in a court in Edwardsville than in New York City or San Francisco or Chicago or Los Angeles? Why? Smaller town, typically more conservative, right? So what they're saying is there shouldn't be a national standard for this. It should be based on contemporary community standards. The dominant theme of the material so it's no longer any portion like we saw in Regina v. Hicklin. Dominant theme of the material taken as a whole. So again, not just one part of it, but you have to look at it in its entirety. You're shaking your head.
I don't know. I'm frustrated with people from the 1950s.
Because it's like, that means if you write a book about like, just, you know, like some sort of utopia or something, and they don't agree with it, they could just say,
themes of this are dangerous?
Probably out, you know, if you're looking at 20th century, and I don't know too much about censorship prior to that time on a wide scale, but probably next to the 1930s, we probably see more book burning, book banning in the 1950s than any other decade. Trevor?
Can you explain more about the dominant theme?
Sure, that it can't just be something that's tangential to it.
So like you have
Not
one character-
central to, and again, we're talking about
Oh.
primarily books. Although we're now in the 50s, films could certainly be there. So it's not that there just happened to be one rogue character that someone said, well, her or his image is obscene. It had to be the entirety.
Isn't that the same thing as taken as a whole?
It is, and in fact, in many ways. In fact, if you look at it, there's a colon, a semicolon there. The dominant theme taken as a whole. They just wanted to have that in there. So you look at the entire piece, and if it's, let's say the book is about human relationships, and a part of it has to do with human sexuality. The sex part is not the dominant theme. Yeah.
I like Kansas books, man.
Is that what? Kansas? Yeah, and that happened during this period, shortly before this period, because of course they thought it was just a dirty book period. And basically it was all about human sexuality. Okay. And he did some funky things, you know, and in his laboratory, he did some interesting things that we won't get into. Which happened, you know, just over no, who was that? Kinsey was in Indiana. Who are the, Masters and Johnson were actually in St. Louis. It's one of the two.
Okay.
Kinsey and Masters and Johnson, the two big sex studies in the 40s and 50s.
Oh, yeah.
They actually did a, like an HBO special about it.
Masters,
Yeah. One of them, does anyone know that? I think it's Masters and Johnson was in St. Louis, actually at Washington University. That's where they did this. And they had people come in and have sex in front of them. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
They didn't have cameras.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. Anyone want to change your major all of a sudden? No. Because what they were looking at was the human response of male and female. Yeah.
I get you there.
Telling it as it is. Okay. Okay. Taken as a whole, appeals to the prurient interest. Prurient interest, that's awesome. Everything that I'm highlighting here, you can fill in between. You don't have to have it written on a test or a quiz, word for word. But it added the average person standard, contemporary community standards, the dominant theme, the work taken as a whole, and that it appeals to prurient interest. What's prurient interest?
Sounds pure.
Yeah, prurient. Actually, it's, and I'm paraphrasing here, it's an interest in sexuality that is abnormal or harmful or whatever. Okay, Cody again, like, what does that mean? Yeah, again, it changes. One definition of it is having a tendency to excite lustful thoughts or as a shameful and morbid interest in sex. Okay, hands again. Anyone has a shameful and morbid interest in sex in here?
I've never. Is he talking about what I'm talking about?
Okay.
I don't think so. What do you think I'm talking about? I think you should just listen. It's open ears. I get it. Yeah. I get it now. I was thinking of balls and just making sure I am.
Okay, is everyone clear through this? We got a couple more cases to get through before we can finish.
15 minutes and go.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to erase this. So we have Hicklin, Ulysses, Roth.
Yes.
Taco-Bellas.
Jacobellas.
I know.
Jacobellas versus Ohio. That's not. All this talk. Ohio versus Ohio, 1964. Okay, this added one other part to what courts could say. It had to be, the material to be obscene had to be utterly without redeeming social value. Okay, so a justice added that.
Isn't that relatively close to what the definition you gave us?
Very, very. Of what?
So violence
Yeah,
in the
yeah. Well, that definition that I gave you at the very beginning of the lecture, that's
That's
contemporary.
current.
Yeah, yeah. This is a very famous case where Justice Potter Stewart said, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. So picture this, if you will, everybody. For this case, the 9 justices of the United States Supreme Court, all men at the time, and I don't know why I picture this, in their gowns still, going down to the basement, the bowels of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., and watching pornography over and over and over.
Sorry.
I honestly don't know that they had their gowns on at the time. It just makes it a little more creepy for me if I think about that. So, but that's what they did. They had to watch it before they could rule on it.
Hands on the table.
They have to watch it together.
What's
I
that?
said, did they watch it
They
together?
did watch it together, yes. Yes, those are the facts.
I'd love to see their black tip.
The next important case, Stanley v. Georgia, 1969. Georgia.
The way you said that.
My southern roots come out every once in a while.
Yes, I like it.
Okay. In this one, this is a Supreme Court case, and they ruled unanimously that possession of pornography, even that which is deemed legally obscene, the possession of that is legal. Is legal. And here you don't have to know this, but this is one of the rulings of the case. If the First Amendment means anything, it means that a state has no business telling a man sitting in his own house what books he may read or what films he may watch. Now, later in the 70s, other courts came in and said, yes, that is true, but the ruling in the ruling in Stanley does not mean that you can't get in trouble by distributing obscene material. But once you have it in your possession, in your home, that's a constitutional right. Again, remember I said I'm going to say the last couple of days talk about the law versus the reality of 2017 America. Okay, Stanley v. So this is all about possession. Okay. Jacobellas, Stanley v. Georgia. Okay.
Didn't we already mention this
No,
at the beginning?
I did.
Yeah,
I mentioned
yeah,
it
that's
as a foreshadowing.
Yeah, to do that a little bit, yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I meant.
So this is currently the standard what came out of Miller v. California. Okay. Now listen to this carefully. It was close, it was a 5-4 vote. It ruled that material could be banned as obscene if it met a 3-part test. First, the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the work taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interest. That is basically the Roth test, right? So you first have to put it through what they came up with in Roth. Second part, the work depicts in a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law.
If we're asked this on like a quiz, do we just put Roth test for the first one?
You can do that.
Okay.
If in fact I have asked about Roth as well, so.
Oh.
Yeah. So what is this adding? It's saying, okay, you have to still follow the Roth test. It's saying it has to be patently offensive, without question. It is offensive. And the behavior that is being represented in film or in books, whatever, has to actually violate a state law. So if there is a state law against a particular sexual act, which there have been for many years, and this shows it, then it can be deemed obscene. First the Roth test, and now this one. Now, here comes, I believe Chris brought it up earlier, the most important part of the Miller v. California ruling. And that is what is known as the lapse test. The work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. I will. The work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So our contemporary standard, which can be characterized by that first, kind of boiled down by that first definition that I gave you, comes out of this Miller test. So it has to pass all 3 parts. It has to pass basically what the Roth said about applying contemporary community standards to an average person, appeals to prurient interest. It has to be patently offensive, and the sexual activity that is being portrayed has to violate particular state law, and it has to not pass the lapse test, meaning that there would be no literary, artistic, political, or scientific value to the work. Now, here's a good question. How do you show that? What do you do? How do you test for this? Yeah, Chris.
I'm kind of guessing, but it has to, it's a test, and that's to have to do with the reasonable, like.
Well, the reasonable person standard is part of Roth.
I'm saying, would the last part, would it have to lack, literary, artistic, political, scientific value to a reasonable person?
No. What would courts do? What would courts do? Because how many people here could consider something, even in this classroom, I would hazard to guess that there are different appreciations of different types of art. And some things that some of us might find fine art, some of you might find vulgar and obscene. So how do we determine? What would the court do? You'd bring in experts, right? Your witnesses would be experts. experts in the fields of science, politics, art, the literary world, and they would testify to the value of this work, which boiled down, what does our contemporary standard of obscenity really mean? How easy is it to ban something for being obscene? It's not easy at all, right? Can anyone think of anything that I'm not going to say that you've perused or anything, that totally lacks literary, artistic, political, or scientific value?
National Enquirer.
50 Shades? Twilight? You really think Twilight's obscene? You maybe just... Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say, this commercial that I saw in 201 that was banned, but I don't even know how to explain it.
Okay, I understand. Yeah.
It's not really banned, but it's a YouTube video called A Strange Thing About the Johnsons.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not gonna explain it.
Okay.
It should be banned.
It should be banned, okay. Again, people would argue there's an artistic side to it. Well, you're good. The only thing good about that is the Family Guy takeoff on it. That's the only thing that's good. Yeah.
So there's one that I know. I don't know if it's banned, but I think that it was 2 girls, 1 cup.
That's what.
Did he say that? I didn't hear that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one was horrible.
Okay, I used to, during our obscenity week, actually make you all jurors and present you with evidence that was presented in a real life case, which I find fascinating, and I think that, everyone here is an adult. A jury of adults actually had to look at this stuff. But at the same time, I've had students in the past tell me they've never been able to unsee it. So I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that to anybody. What's that? I've always told people that, if you didn't want to watch it and be a part of it, it wouldn't affect your grade and you could leave. And what's amazing, in 18 years of teaching this class, I've only had 2 people that entire time leave, and there were 2 guys. It's really shocking to me that left. But I don't think we're going to do it this semester. I know it. Unless between now and Thursday, I just have a real sort of evil hair or something like that. Okay. Yes, sir.
You could make it one of the extra things.
Well, it could be if you all choose obscenity as one of the hypotheticals.
That's all.
Choose one of them. Yeah. Okay. What do you all think about this? We're just about out of time. Hicklin, Regina V. Hicklin, right? Where do you go from there? Go, U.S. versus one book called Ulysses. Then Ross.
It is a lot.
So Jackson thing, like
Andrew, Georgia.
3:30 tomorrow.
California. Now, one more.
We got 30 seconds.
New York v. Ferber. New York v. Ferber, 1982. Remember what Stanley v. Georgia said? I hope you do. It was just a few minutes ago. Possession. Even if something is legally deemed obscene, the government has no right to come into your home and say, you can't read this, you can't watch this. New York v. Ferber, 1982 said, with a major exception of child pornography. That is, the government can indeed come in.
So that's the addition to the other child.
It just added on to what we saw from Stanley v. Georgia. It's just making it very clear that the possession of child pornography is not legal.
Just child pornography.
Just child pornography, yes. Okay, any questions? A lot of cases, but they do seem to flow, and remember what happens? It gets from this really, really obscure, uneven way of understanding what is a scene to a very, very narrow, specific test. Sure.
No one could feel bad. I mean, we're just doing cases now. But this one might be easier.
Even if it's seen, you're fine. That's, they wanted to make that very, child pornography.